Mr. Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege to be here. Malaysia has a rather special place in my sentiments. The very first official activity that I did when I became Vice-Chancellor in the University of Liverpool in 1986 was to come to Malaysia for a meeting of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And I met a great many of your then Vice-Chancellors, and in many ways it gave me an introduction to this country, which I have enjoyed over the successive 30 years, which sounds a bit scary when you say it like that. As the Vice-Chancellor said, I have had a very long career in higher education, and one of the things that is a great privilege is occasions like this, but those occasions on a day-to-day basis. Many people do not realize what fun it is and how much one learns from working with people who are so committed to their profession, but who are also so intelligent and so questioning. And because of that, it has been, for me, a continuous learning process. And to be able to share a little with you is my great pleasure, since I know that there are severe pressures on the system here, but oddly enough, as I was saying to the Vice-Chancellor just before we came here, my whole move into the management of universities came about because of a not that different experience in the United Kingdom in 1981. Those of you with a very good ear will have detected that I'm not English. I'm a New Zealander who went to England in the 60s and stayed. I stayed for one of the nice things about being in the academic domain is so often, if you're lucky, you happen to be in the right place at the right time. And I had just got myself established in Britain when what was probably the most important 20th century document for higher education was published, a document called the Robbins Report, which looked at the British university system in 1962, 63, 64, and said, this is far too elitist. We need to expand the number of universities. And it was at that time they created a lot of the universities that many of you will know. They created a lot of new greenfield universities, universities of great distinction like Warwick. They created a number of technical universities by taking the colleges of advanced technology like Bath and Salford and upgrading them and giving them university status. Why it was the right place to be was that, of course, if you're going to suddenly increase the size of the university system by 30%, you need people. And so a great many of we visitors from the Commonwealth who are there as postdoctoral students or that sort of thing suddenly found that we were being offered teaching posts because they sucked in good people from all of the Commonwealth. And we learned a lot. I did take the precaution of going home to New Zealand in 1968 to decide whether or not I'd stay in Britain or not, and decided I would stay because by background I'm an engineer who specialises in aeronautics and materials, and I just could not do the things in New Zealand that I was able to do with facility in Britain. And that was the start of what appeared to be a very conventional academic career. In due course, I ended up in Sheffield because I had particular interest in steel, and in those days Sheffield as a city was renowned as the sort of steel capital of Britain. Enjoyed it, but became involved in the bits of university management that one has to do as a head of department and the like. And I chaired a resource committee for the Vice-Chancellor. It was a very interesting resource committee, and still to this day is unique in my experience of traditional universities, because it had been set up as a result of some inner differences of opinion, to put it politely. And this committee had as a member of it the Vice-Chancellor, but he was prohibited by the statutes and ordinances from being the chairman. And so the chairman was always drawn from one of the mainstream departments of the university. And I was the chairman of this committee. In 1981, many of you, in fact I suspect all of you will know of the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher. She was then the Secretary of State for Education. In Britain in February you get told what your funding will be for the year which begins in August. In February 1981, the university system there was told that the budgets for higher education were to be cut by about 25%. Sounds familiar, I suspect? It wasn't done evenly, but everybody was affected. We in Sheffield had a cut of about 15%. Some universities, Salford, in particular Bath, had cuts of 35 to 40%. Managing that was clearly going to be something of a challenge. And the only thing the government did to help at that time, which in their view seemed to be what was the only thing needed for sustainability, was to put up a fund to allow us to pay for the early retirement of academic staff. But then you had to go about it because we then, at that time, had a fully tenured system. So if you were a career academic, you had a contract to the retirement age. And so it took some ingenuity to deal with as an issue. What happened in my own personal case was that I ended up, on behalf of the University of Sheffield, writing what I believe is the first quantitative academic plan for a university, which was published in late 1981. I learned a lot in the process about how you evaluate departments, because one of the things I had as a job was to persuade, firstly, my Vice-Chancellor, and then the university, that if you are facing severe cuts, despite the fact that universities are strongly collegial institutions, it is wisest to attempt to evaluate the differences in quality across the university. Not a popular concept, but a concept that all of us in reality know is one of correct measurement of how the university is. It's nice to think we're all equal and all departments are equally strong, but that is not actually the case. And so I persuaded the Vice-Chancellor and then the university that instead of going in for a process of equal misery, where we just handed down the 14% cut to everybody, we should have a process of selective misery where we evaluated the merits of each and every department in the university, looking at its academic talents, looking at its financial talents, looking at its managerial talents, looking at its recruitment talents, and essentially grade each department. One of the nice things about working in that intelligent environment was, of course, that provided you make it very clear to people in the university world that what you're doing is an open and objective process which you are prepared to argue about, defend and justify. They will live with it. Oddly enough, even those who at the end of the day suffer some difficulties. As a result of this, we closed a number of departments, we merged departments, and we did a great deal of reorganization. For me, it was a very big step, as I'm sure it will be for many of you, from the normal rigors of teaching, research and departmental leadership to looking at the system in a holistic way and trying to get a feel for what this organism, the university, was. I found it surprisingly intellectually rewarding. I had been a career researcher. I'd written a lot, I'd published a lot, I'd worked a lot with industry, but I actually found the intellectual demands of thinking strategically really quite fascinating. And so after we'd finished this, and we'd taken the plan through and we were implementing it, I said to my then Vice-Chancellor that I actually quite liked the idea of being a Vice-Chancellor. He sat very steadily and firmly in his own seat and said, "I'm prepared to help you find somewhere to go." And that led me in due course to the University of Liverpool. There, again, we did have contractual pressures because governments are governments. And what it means, I think, is that there were the first blossomings of the idea that you could not sit gently on your seat and enjoy just being an academic. You had other responsibilities, that there were going to be continuing pressures across the system, financial and performance pressures, and that the duty of people responsible for universities, the senior leaders and managers, was to understand that organism and seek to ensure that they optimised the way in which it behaved. The other thing that followed, which was perhaps slightly different to what had gone before, was it made it very clearly apparent that if you're going to have a properly sustainable university which can withstand the buffeting that governments so often bring along, then you have to diversify the way in which you earn your income. All universities are, I should qualify that. All real universities are very dependent upon their undergraduate and postgraduate student body. Of course, we're equally dependent upon support from commerce and industry and research funders and overseas organisations, but the bread and butter of being a university is undergraduate and postgraduate education. Undergraduate education, to some extent, is a public benefit. And of course, the government pays for that, although, as we all know, as I've said before, and as you know, the ways in which they do that are not always consistent. And different governments have different reasons, but then governments have to respond to what's going on in the world around them. And there is no justification for just ignoring the universities and being unduly hard on them, but nonetheless they have to justify their way, and they must provide some return for the investment that comes to them. The other thing that follows is that these important people, the undergraduate and postgraduate population, also have lives that have to be lived, and they want things from that education that you give them which are consistent with having good futures. What this has done, I think, most intriguingly, is it has led to various shifts in the attitude of the student population, so that they begin to have expectations of the university and the staff within the university, which were perhaps not equally manifest when most of us were in our undergraduate days. They want you to create, and one of the buzzwords at the moment, employability. And there's no doubt that that is justifiable. It's also, of course, been encouraged and driven to some extent by the changes in which governments have themselves, changes they have contributed to. There was a time when going to university was not a very expensive business because the government paid. This is no longer the case. Students take out loans, they borrow, and this means that they have, as a consequence, to go out into the world when they graduate, usually carrying, depending upon their exact family position, but for the majority of them, debts. This is the only way in which the governments can afford to pay for what goes on, because they want some of their money back. And you combine that with the expansions that have gone on, and this is a circumstance that is not going to change. So employability becomes quite critical. And the other buzzword, which is very prevalent in our context at the moment, is retention. What is the point of taking young people in, and not so young people in, and educating them if 2/3 of the way through they disappear? That is not good for them. It's certainly not good for the country. You take those combinations, and it does mean that you have to think in different ways. The other thing that has happened is that governments all watch each other, particularly within the Commonwealth, where there are educational systems which have a great deal of common cause, common structure, and common purpose. And so what happens in the UK today happens somewhere else tomorrow. Let me give you one very simple example. Some of you may have picked up that there is talk in Britain at the moment about a process called the Teaching Excellence Framework. We all know how difficult it is to properly evaluate the quality of teaching. A great deal of it is done, of course, through consultation with the beneficiaries of that teaching, the student body. We have a national student survey, which is becoming a little bit of a monster, but it is terribly, terribly important, and people care significantly about it. We also have the responsibilities for retention and employability, and much to the surprise of most of the academic community in the United Kingdom, the Teaching Excellence Framework, that is the evaluation of the quality of your teaching, is done almost solely through metrics. Now, all of us have grown up with, and I'll say a little bit more in terms of the sustainability agenda, about research excellence in due course. And in terms of research excellence, we've all lived with that, because to me, one of the most wonderful and strong and traditional elements of our higher education environment is peer review. If it's fair, if it's objective, and it's done by people whose qualities and skills and achievements and awareness you value and appreciate, then you'll live with the outcomes, even though sometimes they may not suit you. I doubt if there's a person in this room who hasn't had a research grant turned down at some time or other, but that's what peer review is about. You can't win them all. You hope to win more than you lose, but that's by the by. But the Teaching Excellence Framework is not peer review. It takes into account what are your evaluations by students in terms of the National Student Survey, student satisfaction, students' evaluation of your teaching, students' evaluation of your courses. It takes into account employability within 6 months of completing a course. It takes into account retention rates as you go year by year through the system. And it's all done by the universities feeding the data into the central funding body, who then pop it through one of their machines, and out come the answers. It has proven to be a very interesting process. The first evaluations have just been published. They were tactful enough, the central bodies, to say these are provisional evaluations, and as a university you get graded, it's a bit like the Olympic Games, as gold, silver or bronze. There are, as you'll know, and many of you will know them well, some 160 higher education institutions that are subject to this evaluation. In the first cut, 8 were evaluated as gold. And this did not include some of the obvious universities that you know and respect. I am a governor of a comparatively small, 9,000 undergraduates, new-ish university in the small cathedral town of Lincoln. We were one of the 8. Most people who are aware of the UK system know about the Russell Group. The Russell Group was spectacular by its absence in the large from the 8. So things are under pressure in a very real way. So when I learned from the Vice-Chancellor the issues that sit within your own strategic planning framework, and saw that one of them was graduate employability, I couldn't help but feel it might not be inappropriate to tell you about the Teaching Excellence Framework. Next, I saw on his list that you are being encouraged to make entrepreneurs of your graduates. You will be aware that many people believe that entrepreneurs are born and not made, and therefore, what can you actually do to encourage people? Well, you can encourage people to be self-reliant. You can give them the tools. Some of them will use them very well, others will not use them as much. But one of the things that is around and is important is a great deal of information on the teaching of entrepreneurship in one form or another. These are areas where reinventing the wheel, so to speak, is not something one should indulge in. And I'm sure you are being encouraged, and I would, without hesitation, encourage you to go and look at what is online in a very large number of institutions about entrepreneurship, and take from it those elements from all those various publications and curricula, take from them the information that you judge would be relevant to your environment here in Malaysia. I've been much involved with the technology of teaching and learning, which I do see as being a significant change in the way in which most of us used to act in the past. It's been with us for some long time, and we all know there are many, many good online courses, and there are many interesting things going on. I am not from the camp that believes the world is going to be saved by MOOCs. They are useful. Draw from them again. what it is you think might be useful and valuable in your environment. My own experience in the university world has really taught me to have the highest respect for what is given a variety of names. In my vocabulary, I always think of it as blended learning, the mixture between conventional teaching and tutorial structures and access and availability of online support and background information and so on. And I know that this is something that you are already involved with, but I suspect that one of the things that will follow across the sector is an increasing belief in this, because it is one way in which you can bring about some efficiencies in terms of how you deal with staffing issues and particularly staffing reductions, but it is not the be-all and end-all. Oddly enough, in my experience, students actually like people. They like their colleagues and they like the people who teach them. And we as individuals do spend a great deal of our time in communication. I sometimes, in my own fuddy-duddy-ish way, feel that the younger generation's involvement with some aspects of the social media are not intellectually very helpful. On the other hand, their facility with online things is high and can be used both to your benefit and their benefit. Another thing that all governments do, because it is seen as a way of diversifying the income streams we made reference to earlier, is internationalization. But it's an immensely competitive business. You do well, you'll do better. I think you have one real benefit, in that I believe that the biggest change that's on the horizon in terms of internationalization is regionalization. And Malaysia sits in a place where there are very big populations of young people who will want and expect higher education, and not all of them will be able to get it in their own countries. And so I see a great deal of mobility coming. You see it already. I mean, the best example, of course, the most obvious one in terms of numbers is what has gone on in China. But it's not just China. There are lots of countries where mobility will become important. But it will not only be important from the point of view of getting access to facilities that you may not be able to get access to in your own country. It will become increasingly important in the employability context, because there's going to be an expectation that in this now internationalized, strongly and immensely internationalized world, if you as an individual don't have personal experience in environments other than your own, then you are going to be disadvantaged. The other element of that which is important is, of course, it opens the door to increasing, you already have a number of them, increasing the numbers of partnerships. And I think institutions all across the world are beginning to realize that they're not islands. They do have to increase the amount in which they collaborate. Both in a partnership, both partners should benefit. And I think there will be real growth in those domains. It is perhaps easier for some than for others. And I have to say, the people for whom I feel concerned and slightly sorry in a truly international sense are those whose facility with English is less than might be desired. They're going to have to work hard at it. I was advised that one of the other requirements of this manifesto, if I want to call it, in sustainability terms, is to increase financial independence and to reduce your dependence upon government sources. Internationalisation will help with that. It has certainly held the British universities together for a long time, but again, governments do things that just beggar description. In Britain, we're having a terrible set of arguments at the moment because in this slightly funny world we're in at the moment, there are some interesting pressures associated with immigration. The third biggest export business in the United Kingdom is higher education. Tens of billions of pounds every year, and the government is saying to the universities, sorry, you've got to stop taking overseas students, they might stay. You might have thought, I certainly thought, that perhaps the government knew where its immigrants came from. But they don't seem very confident in telling us. And to everybody's surprise, there was a recent publication which showed that terrible contribution to growth in immigration on an annual basis that came from overseas students, 170,000 a year, was in fact not an issue because on average, only about 1,500 of those stay in the United Kingdom. They go back to their home countries or nearby home countries or to other international places which are active in higher education, and they are mobile in a way that perhaps my own generation was not. I think it is something of a falsity that one should worry about that, because the young have responsibilities and they recognise those responsibilities. You have to indulge in high-end research and publication. You do a lot of that already very effectively. But again, to go back to my comment about partnerships and internationalisation, partnerships and research go hand in glove with partnerships and internationalisation. Starting to build a huge research base from scratch is challenging with a capital C. But partnership through finding the right people is important. There are many, many people who have, all across the globe, and even in the very large, distant environments such as the UK and the USA, who have research interests which align very closely with your own research interests, particularly a number of them in the natural environment. Most of the staff will know where these people are, and many of them may already have associations with them. One of the easiest places to begin, and I'm sure this has already happened, but it needs to be built on, is enhancement of those connections, formalising of them, and the building of the long-term sustainable nature of those connections. You're also, I'm told, being encouraged to enhance your rankings in league tables. I am not a great lover of league tables, but sadly, they are a fact of life, and they are something that a great many people look very closely at. Certainly, governments responsible for those very tempting international students. And so working at trying to improve ranks in league tables is pretty much with us forever and a day. Were it purely a piece of research, there's no doubt they will have been dissected and looked at objectively in the way that you dissect and look at what is said, published, comes out of different forms of researchers who perhaps act in areas of your own interest. Apply the same rigour to assessing the tables. I think it's unfair when people make the criticism that looking at, understanding and exploiting the nature of the league table is games playing. Of course it's games played in one way or another, but it's about the success and the future of the institution of which you are a part and for which you have affection and responsibility. Play the game by all means, but for heaven's sake, do play it as well as you can. Let me finish by going back to something of deep personal interest, which is on the list, and that is about improving operational excellence. I've worked at this for a very long time and have always had great attraction. It's not widely known, and many of my colleagues still occasionally shake their heads when they look at me over it. I was taken out of the University of Liverpool in 1991 and asked by the then government, rather oddly and ironically, at that stage under the Prime Ministership of the Iron Lady, if I would look after what was then the University Grants Committee in the UK. And I got there, and I'd been in office 3 months, and I got a call from a senior politician, the Secretary of State for Education, who called me in and said, Graeme, we got you into this government post under false pretenses. Politicians don't say that very easily. Under false pretenses, and the game is all going to change. On Wednesday next week, we're going to publish a new white paper. And this white paper is going to say 2 important things. One, it is going to merge the then traditional university sector and the non-university sector, so that all higher education comes under one umbrella, and all of the polytechnics are going to be turned into universities. You are at will to go off if you don't want to do this. But it was a challenge, and I took on the job. It carried with it 2 other responsibilities which emerged very quickly. One of them was to put in place nationally a scheme of quality assessment of teaching, and the other one was to put in place an assessment of the quality of research. I was architect of what was then called the research assessment exercise, which some of you will have looked at closely. And this is another example of something that, once it was put in place, was embraced by governments with great enthusiasm. And there are performance-based research systems in almost every one of the major Commonwealth economies now. But it made me also, in having done all that, I went back to the university, well, I might say, quite quickly, within 5 years, much to my relief and pleasure. But it made me think quite a lot about how one managed universities. Because for a long, long time, we were not managed. And the expression one heard frequently was dealing with a university is rather akin to herding cats. And those of you who have cats know how unbiddable cats are. I spent a lot of time talking about this with people, one of whom was an ex-student of mine who became head of CSIRO in Australia and responsible for a very, very large research budget. And a small number of years ago, he came to me and he said, Graeme, why don't we write about university management? Why don't we try and do the herding cats business properly? And so we sat down and we said, we can try and do it properly, but if you're going to do it properly, one of the things you have to do is do a sort of peer review in reverse. Ask academic senior managers some questions, ask research managers some questions, and see what they say. And put it all together, and if you tell them, their answers will be used. Some of them may be quoted, but they will be anonymized. They'll come back to you. So we produced 4 questions, which we sent to a great many academics, and researchers in the sector. And the 4 questions were these. What do you know now that you wish you had known back then when you began your career as an academic leader and manager? The second question, if you're mentoring a new leader, a head of department, a dean, a program manager, what would you wish to share with him or her about operations and about strategy? The third question was, what are your favourite war stories that provide lessons that we might share with our prospective audience about herding cats? And finally, what, in your opinion, brings out the best and worst in your people? To our surprise, we got a flood of wonderful answers. And as a result, in 2011, we published a little book called Herding Cats, being advice to aspiring academic and research leaders. It was designed like this because it will fit in a pocket, and it's designed like this because if you do, as most academics do, one long-distance flight a year, it can be read on a long-haul flight. To our complete and utter surprise, it proved to be a great success. The little publishers who did it for us, we are by far and away their bestseller. We're now up somewhere over 10,000, which for a little book like that is a lot. And we've even just, struck me as perhaps important in this interestingly trilingual country, been published in Chinese. We've also been published in, oddly enough, Vietnamese, and we are in the process of being published in Spanish. So it's there. Of course, it would be improper of me to advocate that you get hold of it, but you can very easily. It is full of wisdom, but not our personal wisdom, the wisdom of people like yourselves who have lived in environments like the environment in which you are now living, who have been subject to external pressure and the need to change, and their wisdom, their experience, for better and sometimes for worse, is recorded. I said earlier, when I talked about looking at what is available online and elsewhere from others who have published and put things out, it's part of the same philosophy. You are part of a truly international community. Try as best you can to draw as much on the wisdom and experience of that community. And if you do that effectively, then the battle towards winning greater independence as an institution and greater success in sustainability, I believe, is much more accessible. Thank you.